Racist couple humiliated a black woman in a court garage. Then walked into her courtroom. I said, "What are you doing here? People like you don't belong in restricted areas." The man's voice echoed off the concrete pillars of level 3, each word sharp enough to cut. "Answer me now, or I'm calling security to have you removed." Ruth Jackson stood beside her silver sedan, her assigned parking spot, Judge R. Jackson, clearly marked on the pillar 6 inches from the man's shoulder. At 47, she had learned to recognize this particular breed of anger, the kind that came from never being questioned, never being told no. The January morning humidity still clung to her dark blazer, but her spine remained straight, her leather briefcase steady in her hand. The man in the expensive charcoal suit took another step toward her, closing the distance in the fluorescent-lit cavern of the parking structure. 15 feet. Then 10. His face flushed red with an authority he believed was his birthright. Beside him, a blonde woman raised her phone, recording, her manicured finger hovering over the screen. "We have a court appearance in 20 minutes, the woman added, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "We don't need suspicious people lurking around, making everyone uncomfortable." Ruth's fingers tightened around her briefcase handle, the only outward sign of the calculation happening behind her steady gaze. She knew what they saw, a black woman in a pantsuit who couldn't possibly have earned the right to stand in this space, in their garage, in their courthouse. "People like me," Ruth repeated, her voice surgical in its precision. The man moved closer still. 8 feet. His cologne, expensive, overwhelming, invaded the cold concrete air between them. "Don't play games. Either you explain what you're doing here, or I make the call." He pulled out his phone, thumb already moving toward the screen. Behind them, a security golf cart's electric hum grew louder, approaching from the entrance ramp. The couple exchanged a look, vindication already settling into their expressions. They had no idea that in 23 minutes, they would walk through her courtroom door. They had no idea that the woman they were threatening to have dragged away would be wearing a black robe, sitting behind a bench, holding their future in her hands. But Ruth knew. She had reviewed their names that morning at 5:30 a.m., over her solitary breakfast, Parker vs. Meridian Properties, 9:30 a.m. She said nothing. Sometimes silence was its own kind of power. Sometimes the most devastating response was to simply wait, and remember every single word. The alarm pierced the darkness at 5:15 a.m., but Ruth Jackson was already awake. She had been for 20 minutes, lying in the pre-dawn silence, mentally reviewing the oral argument scheduled for Parker vs. Meridian Properties. By 5:30, she sat at her kitchen table with black coffee and a yellow legal pad, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she dissected each motion, each brief, each potential objection. The solitude suited her. No husband, that had ended 7 years ago when David finally admitted he couldn't compete with her dedication to the bench. No children, a choice she'd made at 32 and never regretted, though her mother still asked about grandchildren every Sunday. Just Ruth, the law, and the weight of 15 years of judicial decisions that had earned her a reputation as exacting, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising. At the courthouse, they called her, the Iron Lady, in hushed tones when they thought she couldn't hear. The clerks respected her. The attorneys feared her. The other judges kept their distance, unable to penetrate the armor she'd constructed over decades of being the only black woman in rooms that didn't want her there. She showered, dressed in her charcoal gray suit, and left her apartment in the affluent Maitama district by 7 a.m. Abuja's morning traffic swallowed her sedan immediately, the usual chaos of danfos weaving between lanes, the honking symphony of impatience, the slow crawl toward the three-arms zone where the federal courthouse stood like a monument to order amid the city's beautiful disorder. The construction sign at the courthouse entrance changed everything, Judges Parking Level 1, closed for repairs. Use Level 3. Ruth's jaw tightened. Level 3 was public parking, shared with attorneys, staff, and visitors. She pulled her sedan up the ramp, found her reassigned spot near the back wall, and checked her watch. 8:35 a.m. Plenty of time. She gathered her briefcase and coffee, stepped out into the concrete cold, and heard the voice that would change everything. I said, "What are you doing here?" Richard Parker's cologne reached Ruth before his words fully registered: expensive, cloying, the kind of scent that announced wealth before manners. He stood 15 feet away, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, his face flushed with the particular anger of someone unaccustomed to questions. "This is restricted parking," he continued, moving closer. "For court personnel only. Not for defendants trying to sneak in early." Ruth's fingers tightened on her briefcase handle. She turned slowly, deliberately, and met his gaze with the same calm she'd cultivated through 100 hostile courtrooms. "I have every right to be here. That's what they all say." The woman beside him, blonde, manicured, dripping with the confidence of inherited privilege, raised her phone. The red recording light blinked on. "We're documenting this. Suspicious behavior. You're making everyone uncomfortable. These people always claim discrimination," Emily Parker added, her voice pitched for the camera. "Always playing the victim." Ruth said nothing. She knew this script. She'd seen it performed 1,000 times in 1,000 variations. The assumptions. The accusations. The casual cruelty wrapped in the language of concern and safety. "Look, I don't want trouble," Richard said, his tone shifting to something meant to sound reasonable. "But we have an important court appearance in 20 minutes, and we can't have people like you lurking around. Just move along, okay?" "People like me," Ruth repeated, her voice surgical. The golf cart's electric whine interrupted them. Officer Musa rolled up, his security uniform crisp, his expression already settled into something between boredom and resignation. He looked at Ruth, looked at the Parkers, and made his calculation in seconds. "Ma'am." He addressed Ruth without asking for credentials, without checking the name on the parking spot pillar. "I'm going to need you to move along. Let's avoid any trouble here." Ruth met his eyes. Saw the choice he'd made. Saw the system working exactly as it was designed. She walked toward the elevator without another word, her spine straight, her silence sharper than any argument she could have made. The chambers smelled of old books and furniture polish, familiar and grounding. Ruth set her briefcase on the mahogany desk her predecessor had left behind and pressed her palms flat against the cool wood. Her heart rate had barely elevated during the garage confrontation, she'd trained herself too well for that, but now, alone, she allowed herself 3 deep breaths. Then she opened her docket folder. Parker vs. Meridian Properties. 9:30 a.m. Civil Case Number 2024, CV 8847. Plaintiffs, Richard and Emily Parker, claiming discrimination by a property management company that allegedly refused them a commercial lease for their luxury import business. They sought damages for lost business opportunities and emotional distress. The irony landed like a physical blow. Ruth pulled the full case file, speed reading through depositions and discovery documents. The Parkers painted themselves as victims of prejudice, claiming Meridian Properties had denied them based on unfair assumptions and discriminatory practices. Their attorney, Marcus Vance, had built the case on testimony about how it felt to be judged, dismissed, treated as less than. The words blurred together, each one a mirror held up to what had happened 45 minutes ago in a concrete garage. Ruth's clerk, Jennifer, knocked softly. "Your Honor, the Parker case is set for 9:30. Do you need anything?" "No." Ruth's voice was steady. "Thank you, Jennifer." She had a choice. Federal judges could recuse themselves for bias or the appearance of bias. One phone call, one signed order, and the Parker case would be reassigned to Judge Williams down the hall. No one would question it. No one would ever know what had happened in that garage. Ruth looked at the framed photograph on her wall, the day of her judicial appointment, her mother's proud face beside her, both of them wearing their Sunday best. 15 years of perfect rulings. 15 years of being above reproach. She picked up her pen and wrote a single note on the case file, proceeding as assigned. Justice didn't recuse itself for convenience. The courtroom felt different at 9:25 a.m., empty except for the court reporter and bailiff completing their pre-session checks. Ruth stood in her private entrance hallway, the black robe heavy on her shoulders, and listened to the murmur of voices filtering through the door as people filed in. She heard Marcus Vance's confident baritone giving instructions to his clients. Heard the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, the ordinary sounds of justice preparing to unfold. Through the slim window in the door, she caught a glimpse of them, Richard and Emily Parker, seated at the plaintiff's table, their expensive clothes and practiced confidence filling the space like they owned it. Emily was reapplying lipstick. Richard was checking his phone. Neither looked worried. They had no idea. At precisely 9:30, Ruth nodded to her bailiff, Thomas, a man who'd worked in this courthouse for 23 years and had seen everything twice. "All rise," Thomas announced, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, "for the Honorable Judge Ruth Jackson." Ruth stepped through the doorway and walked to the bench with measured steps, her eyes forward, her expression composed. She didn't look at the plaintiff's table. She didn't need to. She could feel the recognition ripple through the room like a shockwave. Emily Parker's gasp was audible even from the bench. Ruth settled into her chair, arranged her files with deliberate care, and finally raised her gaze to the courtroom. Richard Parker's face had gone white. Emily's hand clutched her husband's arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit sleeve. Marcus Vance stood frozen, his mind visibly racing through implications and options. Ruth let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to establish control, short enough to maintain professionalism. "Please be seated." Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom, clear and absolute. Case number 2024, CV 8847, Parker vs. Meridian Properties. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? Marcus Vance remained standing. Your Honor, I must request an immediate sidebar. Ruth smiled, thin and precise. Of course, Mr. Vance. But first, let's establish something for the record. She leaned forward slightly. We have much to discuss. The sidebar conference lasted 7 minutes, but Marcus Vance made his argument in the first 30 seconds. Your Honor, given the incident this morning in the parking garage, my clients respectfully request that you recuse yourself from this case. There's been an unfortunate encounter that could create an appearance of bias. Ruth looked at the attorney, mid-50s, expensive watch, the kind of practiced sincerity that came from 3 decades of defending the comfortable against the uncomfortable. An encounter, Mr. Vance. A misunderstanding, Your Honor. His voice carried the smooth apology of someone who'd never actually apologized for anything. My clients deeply regret any. Stop. Ruth's voice cut clean. Mr. Vance, your clients threatened to have me removed from public parking because they assumed I was a criminal. They filmed me. They called security. Not once did they consider that I might belong there. She paused, letting each word settle. Now you're asking me to recuse myself because of their behavior toward me? Behind Vance, Richard Parker had gone from white to red. Emily was crying silently, her phone clutched in her lap like a talisman that had failed her. Your Honor, Vance tried again, I've prepared a formal motion. Which I'm denying. Ruth returned to the bench, her voice carrying to the court reporter. For the record, counsel for plaintiffs has requested recusal based on a pre-trial encounter. The motion is denied. If I recused myself from every case involving parties who had treated me with disrespect or made assumptions about my presence in professional spaces, I would never sit on this bench. We will proceed. She looked directly at the Parkers. This court will evaluate your case based solely on the evidence and the law. You will receive the same fair trial I guarantee every person who enters this courtroom. Nothing more. Nothing less. Richard Parker leaned toward his attorney, whispering frantically. Vance's expression had shifted from confident to calculating. He was already preparing his appeal strategy, Ruth could see it, the backup plan for the backup plan. Mr. Vance, call your first witness. The attorney straightened his shoulders. The plaintiffs call Mr. Robert Meridian, CEO of Meridian Properties. Ruth picked up her pen. The trial would proceed with perfect impartiality. But she would remember every word from that garage. Every assumption. Every threat. And she would make certain that justice, real justice, happened in this room. The testimony unfolded over 3 days, and Ruth listened with the trained attention of 15 years on the bench. Robert Meridian, a careful man in his 60s, explained his company's leasing criteria with precision. The Parkers' business plan had been rejected, he stated, because of insufficient financial documentation and concerning gaps in their previous commercial history. But it was the cross-examination that made Ruth's instincts sharpen. Marcus Vance pressed hard on Meridian's subjective judgments and gut feelings about the Parkers' application. The language felt rehearsed, too polished, like a song performed once too often. That evening, alone in her chambers at 7:30 p.m., Ruth did what she always did when something felt wrong. She researched. Parker vs. Westside Luxury Rentals, 2019. Dismissed. Parker vs. Executive Office Suites, 2021. Settled confidentially. Parker and Parker LLC v. Premium Commercial Spaces, 2023. Dismissed with prejudice. 3 cases. 5 years. Always the same pattern, the Parkers claimed discrimination, always as victims, always seeking damages for being unfairly judged. The cases had different facts but identical emotional cores. We were treated badly because of who we are. Ruth pulled each file, reading depositions until her eyes burned. In the Westside case, 2 witnesses mentioned the Parkers' aggressive behavior toward staff. In the executive suites matter, there were references to inappropriate comments that had been stricken from the record as prejudicial. She made notes in her careful handwriting, then turned to another name that had been nagging at her, Officer Musa. The security personnel files required a formal request, which she submitted through Jennifer with judicial authority. By 9 p.m., she had them. Officer Musa had been named in 4 separate complaints over 18 months, all filed by black courthouse employees, all claiming he had questioned their credentials, asked them to move along, or treated them as suspicious without cause. Every complaint had been reviewed by Security Supervisor Vincent Okonkwo. Every single one had been dismissed as unsubstantiated or personality conflicts. Ruth sat back in her leather chair, the pieces assembling themselves into a picture she'd seen too many times before. This wasn't about one incident in a garage. This was about systems. About patterns. About the machinery of discrimination that ran so smoothly no one noticed the grinding. She picked up her phone and called Jennifer, despite the late hour. I need you to request all security footage from Level 3 parking, January 15, 8:30 to 9 a.m. formal court order. And Jennifer. I need it tomorrow. Supervisor Vincent Okonkwo sat across from Jennifer in the courthouse administrative office, his expression a practiced mask of regret. I wish I could help, but the cameras on Level 3 malfunctioned that morning. Some kind of technical glitch. We've had issues with that system for months. Jennifer, 26 and sharp as broken glass, didn't blink. The maintenance logs show the system was operational. Maintenance logs aren't always accurate. Okonkwo's smile was smooth. You know how these things are. Technology fails at the worst times. She returned to Ruth's chambers with the bad news at 2 p.m. Ruth listened without expression, then made a single phone call to the courthouse IT department. This is Judge Jackson. I need to speak with your senior specialist about data recovery. No, not the supervisor. Someone who actually understands the systems. 20 minutes later, a young woman with bright eyes and nervous energy stood in Ruth's doorway. Ada Okafor, 28, IT specialist, had worked at the courthouse for 3 years and clearly wasn't accustomed to being summoned by federal judges. Your Honor, I'm not sure what I can help with. Ruth gestured to a chair. Sit, please. Ms. Okafor, I need complete honesty from you, and I need you to know that this conversation is protected. Do you understand? Ada nodded slowly. The security footage from level 3 parking, January 15th. Is it truly gone? The young woman's fingers twisted together. Your Honor, the system has automatic backups. Every 72 hours, everything uploads to a cloud server. Supervisor Okonkwo doesn't have access to delete those. Only IT does. And do you have access? Ada met Ruth's eyes. Yes, ma'am. And I already pulled the files when I heard they'd been requested. I knew something wasn't right. Ruth felt something crack in her chest, the small, fierce hope that sometimes, the system had people in it who gave a damn. Can you provide those files to this court under seal? I already have them on a secure drive, Your Honor. Everything. Including the internal security monitor feed showing Supervisor Okonkwo watching the whole incident happen. Including the radio transmission where he told Officer Musa not to check your credentials. Ruth accepted the drive with steady hands. Thank you, Ms. Okafor. You may have just changed everything. After Ada left, Ruth sat alone with the drive, knowing that what it contained would tear through this courthouse like a cleansing fire. The footage would be admitted. The truth would be spoken. And there would be no more malfunctions. No more convenient technical failures. No more looking away. The courtroom was packed by 9 a.m., word having spread through the legal community that something extraordinary was about to happen in Parker versus Meridian Properties. Ruth took the bench with her usual composure, but she could feel the electric anticipation in the air. Mr. Vance, you may continue with your case, she announced. Marcus Vance stood, but before he could speak, Ruth continued. However, the court has obtained evidence relevant to the credibility of the plaintiffs. I'm admitting into the record security footage from January 15, 8:35 to 8:55 a.m., level 3 parking garage. The objection came instantly. Your Honor, that footage has no bearing on. Overruled. Character and credibility are at the heart of this case, Mr. Vance. Your clients claim they were discriminated against, judged unfairly based on assumptions. This footage is directly relevant to how they themselves judge and treat others. The screens flickered to life. The courtroom watched in silence as Richard and Emily Parker confronted a woman beside her car. Watched them accuse, threaten, record. Watched Officer Musa arrive and, without checking credentials, ask the woman to move along. Then the feed switched to the security office monitor, showing Supervisor Vincent Okonkwo watching the whole scene unfold, picking up his radio, and clearly stating, Musa, don't bother checking ID. Just move her along. The Parkers are VIPs. Emily Parker's sob broke the silence. Richard's face had turned to stone. The court calls Supervisor Vincent Okonkwo to testify. Okonkwo took the stand like a man walking to execution. Ruth's questions were precise, surgical, offering no escape. Under oath, he admitted to a protocol of prioritizing the comfort of high-profile visitors over standard security procedures. He admitted that black employees had complained. He admitted he dismissed those complaints as oversensitivity. So you created, Ruth stated clearly, a two-tiered system of treatment based on race and perceived status. I wouldn't characterize it that way, Your Honor. Then how would you characterize instructing an officer not to verify the credentials of a black woman because white plaintiffs felt uncomfortable? Silence. Long and damning. Ruth turned to the Parkers. Your case is built on the claim that you were unfairly judged. This court finds that you have, in fact, been judged, by your own actions, your own words, your own pattern of behavior. Case dismissed. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the bar for sanctions regarding bad faith litigation. She brought down her gavel. The sound echoed like a door closing on one era and opening on another. 6 months later, Ruth stood in the level 3 parking garage at 8:30 a.m., but she wasn't alone. Grace Adeyemi, a young attorney with frightened eyes and a story Ruth knew too well, stood beside her, both of them looking at the spot where everything had changed. He told me I looked like I was lost, Grace said quietly. Asked if I needed directions back to the defendant holding area. I was wearing my court badge. I had my briefcase. But he saw what he wanted to see. Ruth nodded. She'd heard the complaint the day before. Officer Chen, newly transferred, apparently hadn't gotten the memo. Or hadn't cared. Come with me, Ruth said. They walked together through the garage, up the elevator, through the courthouse corridors. Ruth's heels clicked against marble with the rhythm of purpose. She'd spent 6 months reshaping this place, mandatory anti-bias training implemented courthouse-wide, new oversight protocols for security personnel, and a confidential reporting system that actually investigated complaints. Supervisor Okonkwo had been demoted to administrative duty. Officer Musa had retired early. The Parkers had paid sanctions and vanished from the federal court system. But more than procedures had changed. Ruth had changed. The support group met monthly now, 12 black legal professionals gathered in her chambers, sharing stories, strategies, and the exhausting work of surviving in systems designed without them in mind. Ruth, who had spent 15 years armored in solitary competence, had finally learned that strength didn't mean isolation. She'd learned it from Ada, the IT specialist who'd risked her job for truth. From Grace, who'd had the courage to report what happened. From every person who'd been dismissed, overlooked, told to move along, and had refused to accept it. The garage belongs to everyone now, Ruth told Grace as they reached the security office. And we're going to make sure they remember that. She knocked on the door, ready to file another complaint, another demand for accountability. The Iron Lady, they still called her. But now the iron had been tempered into something more flexible, more dangerous, a blade that cut through institutional rot with precision. The courthouse would change. She would make certain of it. One complaint, one case, one moment of truth at a time.